There was a man late in his life who confessed to me that he no longer recognized the face in the mirror. He was 62 years old, successful by every measure his society demanded, and yet, when he stood alone in the silence of his own bathroom each morning, a stranger stared back at him. He told me this with the half-smile of someone who already suspected that the stranger was in fact the only honest thing left in his life. And I remembered, as he spoke, an old dream he had described to me weeks earlier, a dream in which he descended a spiral staircase into a basement he had never known existed beneath his own house, and there, in the dark, he found a child weeping, a king sleeping on a throne of dust, and a woman whose face he could not quite see, but whose voice he had heard all his life. He had awakened from that dream trembling. He had not understood it, and yet something in him had begun to listen. I have told this story many times because it captures something essential about what I came to call the archetypes, those ancient, impersonal, and astonishingly alive figures that wait beneath the thin crust of the modern personality. The man in my consulting room had not gone mad. He had, perhaps for the first time in his life, become sane. He had begun to suspect that the self he had spent 6 decades building was not the whole of him. There were others living within him, older ones, stranger ones who had been there long before his name was ever written on a birth certificate. This is where I must ask you to pause before we go any further and consider a question that most modern men and women never dare to ask themselves. Asterisk, who exactly is speaking when you say I? Asterisk, you assume, of course, that it is you, singular, continuous, the same self who was a child and who will, presumably, be an old man or woman one day. But I have spent a lifetime listening to dreams, and I can tell you, with the quiet certainty of one who has descended into those waters again and again, that the I is a small island in a vast and ancient sea. And the sea has currents, and the currents have names, and those names are older than any language you have ever spoken. The ancients knew this. They did not call them archetypes, of course. They called them gods. They called them diamonds, spirits, ancestors, fates. They built temples to them, made offerings, listened to their oracles, and when the modern mind, drunk on its own rationality, dismissed all of this as superstition, it did not banish the gods. It only banished the language by which we once spoke to them. The gods did not die. They went underground. They became, in our age, the unrecognized forces that ruin marriages, drive nations into war, possess artists and tyrants alike, and whisper to the lonely man at 3 o'clock in the morning that his life has been a mistake. Asterisk, the gods have not descended from Olympus. They have been banished into the unconscious. Asterisk, and from there they govern us still. Only now we have no name for what governs us. When I first began to recognize this in my patients, I was a young physician, still half a disciple of Freud, still convinced that the personal unconscious, the buried wishes, the forgotten traumas of childhood was the whole of the inner world. But there were things I could not explain by personal history alone. A peasant woman who had never opened a book described in the throes of a psychotic episode a precise solar phallus mythology I later found in an obscure ancient Greek text she could not possibly have read. A child of 7 dreamed of a great serpent encircling the world, an image I would later trace through Norse, Egyptian, and Aztec mythology. These were not memories. They were not learned. They were rising somehow from a stratum of the psyche that did not belong to the individual at all. Asterisk. And here begins the darkest game of the unconscious. Asterisk. I came to call this stratum the collective unconscious, and the figures that inhabited it, the archetypes, they were not images exactly. They were patterns, predispositions, potentials, ancient grooves worn into the structure of the human soul by hundreds of thousands of years of human experience. Just as the human body carries within it the evolutionary memory of every organism that came before it, the gill arches of the fish in the embryo, the reptilian brainstem beneath the cortex, so too the human psyche carries within it the experiential memory of every fear, every love, every encounter with mystery that our species has ever known. The archetypes are the inheritance of being human. You did not choose them. You were born already speaking their language, even if you have spent your whole life pretending you did not understand it. But the most surprising part is yet to come, because what I observed was that these archetypes did not merely produce images in dreams or myths. They organized lives. They cast people into roles they did not choose and could not escape. A man would marry a woman who looked nothing like his mother and discover 15 years into the marriage that he had married his mother after all. Not the real woman who bore him, but the archetypal mother, the great mother projected onto a stranger's face. A woman would fall in love with a man she barely knew and weep for him as though he were the lost beloved of her soul, because he was not the man, but the figure she carried within her, the inner masculine she had never met in herself. These were not coincidences. These were the archetypes, doing what they have always done, arranging the theater of a human life from behind the curtain. Let us speak first of the one most modern people refuse to acknowledge, the one I call the shadow. The shadow is everything in you that you have refused to be. It is the dark twin who walks behind you, made of all the impulses, traits, desires, and capacities that you, in the course of becoming a civilized and acceptable person, had to push out of the light. Your cruelty, perhaps, your laziness, your sexuality, if you were raised to be ashamed of it, your ambition, if you were raised to be modest, your tenderness, if you were raised to be strong. Whatever you had to deny in order to be loved, in order to belong, in order to survive, that is what your shadow carries for you in the basement of your psyche, growing more powerful in the dark with every passing year. And here is the cruel mathematics of it. What you refuse in yourself, you will see with crystalline and burning clarity in others. You will find in the world around you exactly the people who embody the qualities you have exiled in yourself. And you will hate them with a hatred entirely disproportionate to anything they have actually done to you. Asterisk. Why does that colleague enrage you so completely? Why does that politician disturb your sleep? Why does that family member's voice ignite something in you that nothing else can? Asterisk. Because they are wearing for you the mask of your own disowned self. They are carrying in the daylight what you have hidden in the dark. And you do not hate them. You hate the part of yourself they have made visible. The work of integrating the shadow is the first true labor of the soul. And I called it shadow work long before that phrase was reduced to a fashionable slogan. It is not pleasant. It does not feel like liberation, at least not at first. It feels like betrayal. The betrayal of the carefully constructed self you have been defending all your life. To meet the shadow is to admit that you are not who you thought you were. You are also the petty one, the envious one, the one who has secretly wished harm on those you claim to love. You are also the coward, the liar, the manipulator, not in your acts perhaps, but in your potentials, in the seeds that lie sleeping in the soil of your being. To know this and to bear the knowing without despair is the beginning of wisdom. Asterisk. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Asterisk. But the shadow, fearsome as it is only the gatekeeper. Beyond it lie figures even more disorienting to the modern ego, because they do not even share the gender by which you have come to define yourself. In every man I observed, there lived a feminine figure, the Anima, who was the bridge between his conscious mind and the deeper unconscious. In every woman, there lived a masculine figure, the Animus, who served the same function. These were not metaphors. These were psychic realities, as vivid in dreams as any character you have ever met, and far more influential in waking life than most people ever realize. The Animus in a man was the personification of all that he had not developed in himself, the receptive, the intuitive, the moody, the connected, the soulful. She was the figure he had first encountered in his mother, then in his sisters, then in every woman he had ever loved, and most of all, in the women he had loved beyond reason and beyond explanation. Asterisk. What mythology has been trying to tell us for centuries in the figure of the goddess and the muse and the beloved is precisely this, that no man ever fell in love with a woman alone. He fell in love with a woman, and with the figure he projected upon her, the anima, the inner feminine, whose face he had never seen and whose voice he had heard since the day he was born. And when the projection broke, as it always did, when he woke one morning beside her and realized she was not the goddess he had married, but a tired and complicated human being, he did not always have the courage to do what was required, which was not to leave her, but to take the projection back and to begin at last the work of meeting the anima within himself. The anima in a woman was the inner masculine, the carrier of her capacity for focus, for assertion, for clarity of judgment, for action in the world. She had first encountered him in her father, then in her brothers, then in her teachers and mentors and lovers. And she too could spend a lifetime in pursuit of him in outer form, marrying one man after another in search of the strong one, the wise one, the one who would finally tell her who she was, never recognizing that the one she sought was within her, waiting to be claimed. To meet the Animus was to claim her own authority, her own voice, her own capacity to stand in the world without permission from any outer man, and the work was not easy. The Animus, when unintegrated, could become a tyrant within, a harsh inner voice, a paralyzing critic, a chorus of judgment that drove some women into silence and others into rage. Asterisk, the detail most people overlook, hides precisely here, that the inner figure, if denied, becomes a persecutor, if welcomed, becomes a guide. I have watched over the decades what happened when men and women began the long work of integrating these contrasexual figures within themselves. Marriages that had been deserts became gardens, not because the spouses changed, but because the projections were withdrawn and the actual human being across the breakfast table became visible, perhaps for the first time. Artists found new sources, thinkers found new feeling, feelers found new thought. Something old and divided began to become whole. And this wholeness, this slow, sometimes painful coming together of what had been split, was the heart of what I called individuation. But before I speak of individuation, I must name another figure, the one that stands between the shadow and the world. I called it the persona. The persona was the mask, the face you wore in public, the role you played for your colleagues, your neighbors, your audiences. It was not a lie. It was a necessity. No one could live in society without some form of persona. The man who had no persona was as crippled as the man who was nothing but persona. The danger I observed lay not in having a mask, but in mistaking the mask for the face. Asterisk. And here is the darkest game the modern world plays. It has made the persona into the only self most people will ever know. Consider what has happened in this age of images. The modern man and woman wake in the morning and immediately reach for a device on which they will perform all day long a curated version of themselves, for friends, for strangers, for an invisible audience of judges. The persona, which was once a single mask worn in particular contexts, has metastasized. It has colonized the inner life. People now feel anxiety when they cannot present themselves. They feel shame when the performance falters. They grieve in some buried part of themselves. For a real self, they no longer remember how to find. Asterisk, modern man has lost his gods, but not his need for them. Asterisk, and so he has made gods of his own image, and he kneels before the screen as before an altar, and he wonders why he is so tired. The persona, when it has eaten the soul, leaves behind a peculiar kind of emptiness. The successful man at the height of his career who feels nothing. The beautiful woman surrounded by admirers who weeps in the bathroom at her own birthday party. The respected elder who realizes on his deathbed that he never actually lived his own life. He lived the life that was expected of him, the life that fit the mask. These are not rare cases. These are the modern epidemic, and I encountered them daily in my consulting room, decades before the words burnout and existential crisis became fashionable. The disease was the same. The persona had grown too thick. The real self had been buried beneath it, and the soul, refusing to die quietly, had begun to send up its messengers. depression, anxiety, sudden inexplicable longings, dreams of strange basements, and weeping children, and sleeping kings. Beyond all these figures, the shadow, the anima, the animus, the persona, there lay a deeper center, the one I came to call the self. The self was not the ego. The ego was a small conscious island, useful and necessary, but limited. The self was the totality, the unifying center of the entire psyche, conscious and unconscious together, the great organizer of meaning and purpose in a human life. The self was what the alchemists had been seeking when they spoke of the philosopher's stone. It was what the mystics meant when they spoke of God within. It was the image of wholeness, and its symbol, appearing again and again in the dreams of my patients, was the mandala, the circle, the fourfold figure that integrated all opposites into a single living unity. The journey toward the self was what I called individuation, and it was not a destination, but a direction, the slow, lifelong process of becoming who you most deeply are, of bringing into consciousness everything that had been unconscious, of integrating the opposites within yourself rather than fleeing into one side or the other. To individuate was not to become perfect. It was in some ways to become more imperfect, to admit the cruelty as well as the kindness, the chaos as well as the order, the death impulse as well as the life impulse, all of it, the whole human inheritance, owned and consciously born. Asterisk, the real turning point begins right here, in the moment when a person stops trying to be only good and begins instead to be whole. I have been asked often what such work looks like in practice, and I have always been reluctant to give recipes, because the path of individuation was by its very nature individual. What worked for one soul did not work for another, but there were practices I had found useful, and I will name them, with the caution that they were invitations rather than prescriptions. The first was attention to dreams, not as puzzles to be solved, but as letters from the unconscious, to be received with the same respect one would give a letter from a wise and slightly difficult friend. The second was what I called active imagination, a kind of waking dream, in which one engaged the figures of the inner world in dialogue, not to control them, but to listen to what they had come to say. The third was the slow, patient work of recognizing one's projections, of noticing every time one was seized by a powerful reaction to another person, that something within oneself was being mirrored back. And the fourth, perhaps the hardest, was the willingness to suffer, not to suffer pointlessly, but to suffer consciously, to bear the tension of the opposites within oneself, without collapsing into one side, without demanding resolution before the time was ripe. The alchemists had a name for this stage. They called it the nigrido, the blackening, the dark night in which the old self died so that something new could be born. They followed it with the albedo, the whitening, the purification, and finally with the rubedo, the reddening, the integration, the new life. They were not, of course, describing chemical processes. They were describing in coded form the stages of the soul's transformation. Asterisks. The alchemists were not seeking gold. They were seeking the transformation of the soul, and they knew, as I came to know, that no one passed through the nigredo without weeping. There is something I have not yet said, and which I must say now, because it is the heart of all of this. The archetypes are not enemies, they are not pathologies. They are the very fabric of what makes you human. And the suffering they cause is not the suffering of disease, but the suffering of birth. When a man's shadow rises up and disturbs his comfortable life, it is not punishing him, it is calling him toward a larger self. When a woman's animus tortures her with self-doubt, it is not destroying her, it is demanding that she claim a power she has not yet been willing to claim. When the anima drives a man into a love affair, he cannot explain. She is not ruining him. She is dragging him by the only means available toward the soul he has been refusing to meet. Asterisk, what Jung said about this is deeply unsettling. The very forces that wreck our lives are the same forces that, if welcomed, will remake them. This is the paradox at the heart of the work, and I must state it plainly. The light you are seeking is hidden in the darkness you are avoiding. The strength you long for is buried beneath the weakness you despise. The love you have not found in the world is waiting in the figure you have refused to meet within yourself. Asterisk. In the darkest corner of your soul waits the light you fear the most. Asterisk. And there is no shortcut. There is no technique that will spare you that descent. The treasure is in the cave, and the cave is guarded by the dragon, and the dragon is some part of yourself you have not yet had the courage to face. This is the oldest story humanity has ever told. It is told in every mythology, in every religion, in every fairy tale that has survived the centuries, because it is the true story, the only story, the story of what it means to become a human being. I think now of the man I spoke of at the beginning, the one who did not recognize his face in the mirror. He returned to me many months later, and he was changed, not transformed, not enlightened, not healed in any final sense, but changed. He had begun to listen to his dreams. He had begun to wonder about the king on the throne of dust, and the weeping child, and the woman whose face he could not see. He had begun in his own halting way the walk of meeting them. And he told me, with a different kind of smile than the one he had worn before, that the stranger in the mirror had begun to feel less like an enemy and more like a brother he had not yet been introduced to. This, I told him, was already a great deal. This was already the beginning of the road. The archetypes are waiting in you. They are waiting in your dreams, in your moods, in the people who fascinate you and the people who repel you, in your sudden enthusiasms and your inexplicable griefs. They are waiting in the figures you encounter when you sit quietly with yourself and let the mind grow still. They are waiting in the symbols that have followed you perhaps all your life, an animal that keeps appearing, a color that haunts you, a number that returns. Asterisk, he who shuns the descent into the underworld will never truly ascend. The ancient ones knew this. The alchemists knew this. The shamans, the mystics, the poets, all of them knew this. And what I came to understand after decades of listening was that the modern psychotherapist was only the latest name for an office that was as old as humanity itself. The office of the one who helped souls remember what they had forgotten. And here we arrive at the question I must leave you with, because I have learned in a long life of asking questions that the question is more useful than the answer. Asterisk, who are the figures you have not yet met within yourself? Not the ones you wish you were, not the ones you have constructed for the world to see. The others, the strangers in the basement of your house, the king sleeping on the throne of dust, the child weeping in the corner, the woman or the man whose face you have not yet allowed yourself to see. They are waiting. They have always been waiting. And the work of a life, the only work that truly matters, I have come to believe, is the slow, brave, often painful work of going down those stairs into the rooms you did not know were yours, and saying at last to the figures you find there, asterisk, I see you, I have always seen you, tell me your names. The mirror will not lie to you in the end. The face you do not recognize is the face you have been refusing to recognize. And the moment you begin to look at it, without flinching, without judgment, without the desperate insistence that it be other than it is, in that moment, something ancient stirs in you, something that has been waiting since before you had a name, and it begins to speak. And if you can listen, really listen, with the part of you that knows how to listen to dreams, and to symbols and to silences, you will hear, beneath the noise of the modern world, the oldest words ever spoken to a human soul. Asterisk, become who you are. Become all of who you are. The journey is the only homeland. When was the last time you went down those stairs? When was the last time you sat in the dark, without your devices, without your distractions, and let the figures come forward? They are there. They have been there since the day you were born. And the question is not whether they exist. The question is whether you will live your whole life pretending you did not hear them, or whether you will, one quiet evening, finally turn toward them and ask the question that changes everything. Asterisk, who is there? And then listen, really listen, for the answer is older than language. The answer is you.